events which is related to the work of the Public Council of Россотрудничества. We have a number of very famous experts in our Public Council, and actually once a month we organize these kind of events, meetings with them, in order to discuss various topics. And today we're going to speak about very important thing for the agency today, because Россотрудничество is slowly drifting towards more focus on the assistance to international development. And actually, it becomes one of the priorities of our work. We see that there is a need for better coordination between different agencies of the Russian Federation in this area, because Russia, as you all know, does a lot in order to help other countries to assist in their development. We construct schools and hospitals. We provide training and education in the Russian universities. We do a lot of things, but quite often, due to various reasons, it is not quite well known in the audience, in the target audiences, in the public, and also in the expert community. Moreover, there are some also problems and difficulties with providing statistics, truthful statistics, because actually the matter of measuring all this assistance, it also is quite vague in Russia, and some agencies regard some of their activities as assistance to international development, others do not. So we're going to speak about these issues, and we have two brilliant speakers today. One of them is Fёdor Lukьянов, who is editor-in-chief of the journal which is called Russia in Global Affairs. He's also a member, one of the leading experts of the Vladimir Club and of the various other institutions. He has his own TV program, and he is well known in Russia and abroad because of his comments on the Russian foreign policy. And also our other speaker will be Vladimir Bартенев, who is the director of the Center for the Problems of Security and Development and associate professor of the Moscow State University, the Lomonosov University. And he is also the chair of the commission of our Public Council of Россотрудничества on the issues of assistance to international development. So I suggest that we ask our speakers to give us a kind of brief introduction into the topic for about, let's say, 20 minutes, and then we can ask questions, discuss all this, and as usual, you can use our chat to write your questions, or if you wish, you can raise your hand. There is this option in the Zoom, so you can raise your hand, and then I will give you the floor to ask your question or to give your comment. So first, let's address then to Fёdor Lukьянов, who is going to speak about, who is going to speak about why Russia in general needs this kind of approach, this kind of efforts to assist other countries in international development, how it all complies with the Russian foreign policy in general, and Russia's role as a global leader. Fёdor, please.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation and for this opportunity to address such a distinguished audience. I'm a little bit surprised that we have our event in English, but okay, that's international language. Let's stick to that.
Well, the idea was just to explain. The idea was that we would like to cover the audiences in different countries, and we assume that it's quite important for them to learn more about Russia's role in this area. So that's why we have chosen English as a major language.
Okay. So I think everybody who is trying to discuss international relations nowadays is basically doomed to fail, because the complexity and paradoxality of what is going on in the world is such that even the most experienced and most able commentators, analysts, they sometimes they lose understanding of what is going on. So, for example, for me, the biggest challenge, the biggest surprise recently was that my dear senior colleague and friend and mentor, Sergei Alexandrovich Karaganov, whom I know for many, many years and who used to be fantastically insightful about the processes, international trends. Many times I was really surprised how deeply he could analyze when no one could see trends. He could do it in advance. This time he confessed to me that unfortunately I lost understanding what is going on and what will happen. Maybe because I'm too old, but probably not just because of that, but because of pretty irrational development which is going on in international affairs. So I will try to give a very short description of, so to say, of a framework in which we need to operate, not just Russian Federation, but everybody, because I think it's quite common challenge to all of us, to all countries. It doesn't matter big ones or middle-sized or tiny ones, because the nature of challenges and the nature of actually nowadays the nature of calamity we are being confronted with is such that no one can escape it. And this calamity is not just pandemic. The pandemic, as it has been stated many times already, pandemic did not create a new international situation. Practically all trends which we are discussing today, they did exist before, and they were accumulated for a while, sometimes for quite a significant while. But of course, pandemic and this shock which all of us experienced 2020 served as a very big catalyst for those processes which were started years ago as a reaction on the transformation of the nature of globalization. So in 2 months, less than 2 months, we will remember one of important benchmarks in international politics, 30 years after dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was formal embodiment of the end of certain international order, world order. And since that, we lived in another international environment, which seemed to be another order. So now we used to call it liberal world order. In practical terms, it was a product of Soviet and communist side defeat in the Cold War, when Western powers led by the United States got their so-called unipolar moment, the ability to shape international system according to their views and ideas, how they believed it was needed. So we don't have time and necessity to discuss what was the nature of this liberal order. Most important is that starting from maybe early or at least mid-2000s, this kind of international arrangements started to face increasing problems inside, I mean, in relationship between main actors, and outside. I mean, the global challenges which started to have impact on international trends. This crisis of globalization became absolutely visible 6-7 years ago. The main challenge to globalization came not from China, not from Russia, not from, say, Iran or any other countries which were considered as those who opposed international liberal order. By the way, it was not the case in many situations. We did not oppose it, neither Russia nor China, for example. But the challenge came from within, from most important Western states. 2016 with Donald Trump and Brexit demonstrated that globalization ceased to be suitable for societies in countries which launched this globalization. And so why I speak about this, I think that the main thing which happened recently, which happened 2020, was the very due to pandemic. The very fact that suddenly the feeling of predetermined development disappeared, because the whole philosophy, the whole concept of the end of history, which prevailed after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, was based on the assumption that things can develop differently, of course, and not necessarily purely linear, in a linear manner, but sooner or later, the final destination will be reached, and this destination will be, so to say, universal for all. Destination which was formulated by most developed, advanced Western countries, the market economy plus liberal political system. And that was, as Frank Fukuyama wrote, was basically the crown, the culmination of history, political and social history. And that was nothing beyond that, but to expect how quickly this model will be extended to the whole world, not just to the West, but to the whole world. So in this context, globalization was seen as something absolutely indispensable, irreversible, and natural. So even those who opposed global development, and there were many in different countries, those who emphasized negative sides of globalization, basically they did not believe in the opportunity to reverse that, to change this global system. And the question was rather about whether other countries not included in the core, so to say, of this global development, would be able to adapt themselves to this, to improve conditions for them, but not to change profoundly this framework. And that was, again, I would like to repeat and emphasize, that was the universal wisdom, that globalization is here to stay. Maybe slightly changed, slightly corrected, but here to stay. What happened what happened March, April 2020, it turned out that the whole globalization can be practically switched off within 1 week globally. It's a little bit exaggerated because, of course, the whole world didn't stop completely, but if you look at 4 basic freedoms of movement, which did shape the nature of globalization, movement of people, goods, money, and services. We can also add now data and information. All those were deeply affected, starting from almost complete stop of human mobility, and then, of course, money, services, goods in different ways, at different level, but still, none of those freedoms remained unaffected. And even data and information, we see what happens now in the world. There is a growing wish on the side of all governments, be it democratic governments, autocratic governments, all governments would love to control more of all those information flows for reasons which are very easy to understand. So that showed suddenly that this irreversibility of development is not in place. and the future can be different. More than that, the future can be different, not just different from globalization, different from what we expected before, but it will be different for different actors. Because all countries entered the closure, the lockdowns, they closed down at the same moment for understandable reasons, because of the pandemic, because of virus. But as we see now, and as we certainly will see in months and maybe years to come, the opening up will not be simultaneous and will be very much different. All will use this situation to consider to what extent countries and societies should open up, when they should open up, how, to whom, and so on. And this is a completely new situation. What is essential, we can speak about that more if you have questions. So, but I think coming back closer to our main issue, what is the most important consequence of what happened? I think that the domestic resilience of all countries starts to become absolutely crucial priority for all governments without any exemption. So its era of expansionism is over. Expansionism, which was based on different motives, be it colonial, be it liberal, be it Soviet, whatever. But now I think expansionism will be measured through the indicators of whether it can help to maintain and to preserve domestic stability and resilience for all countries, or maybe expansionism will harm it because it will take more of resources needed for more urgent and more vital issues. And here we come to this international assistance and cooperation, because assistance and cooperation will be, maybe we can discuss it later, but now it will become a luxury actually for any country, including the most capable and the richest ones. But it does not mean that any cooperation will stop, not at all. But now to engage in fruitful and important and needed cooperation, that will be each time a decision on both sides. What all of us, what both of us, or if it's multilateral, what all of us will get out of that, just for this, for our ability to successfully develop our countries and societies. I think it's a okay, not completely, but it's a new situation. The situation of increasing responsibility for all those like us who actually should propose what kind of cooperation is needed and what kind of cooperation maybe should be dropped, because resources are limited anyway. And this is an extremely important thing, how we will organize this work in, I'm afraid, years, if not decades to come, because it's not, as we understand now, immediately after pandemic started, it was initial hope that maybe it will be like a short period and then life will come back to the normal. Now we know it will never come back to the normal as we knew it until 2019. So it's over. What kind of international system with those multiple futures, which I mentioned, will emerge and will be erected by all of us in the next period, that remains to be seen. But again, the rationality in approaches towards what should be done between countries to strengthen things which are needed for bilaterally or multilaterally, and to remove those elements which maybe are nice, but not vital. I think this is what all of us will face in the foreseeable future for a pretty long period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fedor. Very interesting and I would say provocative sometimes, but thought-provoking at the same time ideas. So just a very brief questions before we pass to another speaker, just to follow up, to make some follow-up of what you've said. So question number one, taking into account that Russia is quite a generous country, right? So we're known for our generosity. So how can we help other countries in this world, which is unpredictable, ruining, etc.? So shall we play this role if we claim to be a global leader, or shall we just, like, as you said, like other countries, try to stay more focused on our internal problems rather than kind of helping others?
I don't see any contradiction because first of all, generosity per se is not a big virtue, because you can be generous, but if you don't understand why you spend resources and money and for what, then your generosity will be not appreciated, first of all. And unfortunately, in previous years and decades, we had a lot of examples of in relationship with several countries where Russia believed it was very generous and positive, while other countries never believed the same. So I think it's the reasonable level of selfishness is always better than an attempt to demonstrate generosity without any concrete plan. At the same time, I think that, of course, and the ability to help others and to help others through increasing not influence. I think we should reformulate. Russia should help, for example, neighboring states to overcome problems, not because Russia wants to influence those states. It's out. We are not in the imperial era, so each country should be responsible for itself and should know that. But since we are in a new situation, but the world is still tightly interconnected, and I don't see any reason why it will be fragmented completely and fall apart in any foreseeable future. This connection will continue, but differently than before. So by helping others, you help yourself. And that is more or less universal to everybody.
Mm-hmm. And the question number two also about, well, we know that there is a growing, let's say, gap between the countries in the world. And as you said, some countries like the pandemic so much and the idea of closing up. But actually, of course, it affects the international development. But at the same time, well, due to the crisis, it's not only the countries that are kind of isolating themselves from the rest of the world, but there's a growing need for external assistance. And we see it in Africa, we see it in many other parts of the world, that the so-called developing countries, they are crying for help in this new pandemic conditions. So will this lead to, I don't know, some global tensions, or how we will actually try to meet this demand as an international community?
You know, that's a very big question. So I think we can dedicate a special event to that. Very briefly, you know, that's very important conceptual difference. For example, look at the most fashionable issue nowadays, the climate change. What kind of approach we did have to climate change in, say, 1990s when Kyoto Protocol was formulated, or later in 2000s, and until relatively recently with the Paris Accord and so on. That was an approach, probably very sincere and well intended, that global problems demand global solutions. Only the whole world can address problems which are global of their nature. It sounds logical. And that was the approach with those conventions and protocols and so on. It didn't work, as we know. And the results today are such that we can just say it, that it didn't work. What we see now everybody speaks about climate change again. And this is presented as a unifying issue. But in fact, the approach is diametrical. That each country, each important country, not all countries have any impact, but those who have, they formulate their own strategies. Sometimes those strategies are absolutely contradicting to each other. And this is actually a very competitive issue, an issue which can produce contradictions and collisions between different states, despite the fact that all of them are directed towards addressing climate issue, which is global. So is it bad or good? I think it's good, because each state or group of states, like European Union, they should address their problems. Of course, next step is that it should be more or less harmonized with other interests. And then it's very difficult. I'm not sure we will manage that. And now tomorrow, when is it? The day after tomorrow, there's a big climate summit in Glasgow. But this is the only way, because otherwise, either we have nothing like Kyoto Protocol and so, which doesn't work, which is beautiful but doesn't work, or we have just another war, climate war between different actors. I think it's an example which can be transferred to everything. So selfish, I'm sorry for being that blunt, but selfish interest at the end of the day is better if, of course, you understand that to achieve your goals, you need to take into account other goals as well.
Okay, so with this motive of selfishness, we move to Vladimir Bартенев, who is one of the leading Russian experts on actually development assistance. And I think that we can have some, as far as I understand, right, what Vladimir is going to speak about, we may have some clash of ideas here. So Vladimir, please.
Maybe. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will put on my slides. Since my presentation will be more probably practical, I would also use some figures to illustrate my points. So it will be called Russia's International Development Cooperation, Characteristics, Current Priorities, Partnership Modalities. And I will be making this presentation wearing two hats, as the saying goes. One of these hats is a director of the Center for Security and Development Studies. It was established 10 years ago under the aegis of Moscow State University School of World Politics. And it was a direct follow-up to my engagement in a very important project, Russia as a Donor Initiative, which was launched by the World Bank with support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Finance of Russian Federation, and with some financial funding from the UK DFID. In the last decade, our center was involved in fundamental research on challenges lying at the nexus of security and development. And it's hard for me to name a big project on international development project cooperation in Russia that was implemented without myself or my colleagues participating. And my second role is that of head of the Commission on International Development Cooperation of the Public Council under Россотрудничества. It was formed this year. And this body has two main tasks. First is to make recommendations on improving Russia's development cooperation policies, making it more effective. And the second task is to draw public attention within Russia as well as abroad to Russia's actual, real contribution to international development. And I do hope that my talk today will fulfill both these tasks. So I will pose several questions. How does real development cooperation profile of Russia differ from the virtual, from imaginary version that we might all have? What are Russia's key competitive advantages as a provider of development cooperation? And the third point is how to make current and future development partnerships more effective. And I suppose that we will have time for Q&A session and an open discussion to address this issue a little bit more. So I was thinking of a word that would actually describe the best what my mission today will be. And I found it. It will be a sort of demystification. Demystification is the act of making something difficult to understand easier and clearer. And this is exactly what is actually necessary in any talk about Russia's international development cooperation. Because as Fёdor Lukьянov said about international development, international relations in general, the one who is trying to understand what Russia's as a donor looks like is also doomed to fail if he uses only the official figures and official statistics. So there are two reasons for that. The first reason is technical, because there is a lack of publicly available data on Russia's donor policies in English or any other foreign language. And this alone can explain some prejudices, stereotypes, and even myths about Russia as a donor. But for many years, there was also a political factor. Which means that there is a constant and regular attempts on the certain countries to downplay Russia's role as a donor, to downgrade it and present it in a different fashion. So I think it is important to understand that Russia's development cooperation, Russia as a provider of development cooperation, is more mature, more significant, more versatile, more ambitious, and more dynamic than often portrayed. And I will explain it later. So if we will talk about Russia as a more mature donor than often portrayed, the Western academic discourse tends to place Russia in a rather vague and quite a diverse grouping of so-called emerging or new donors. And it is a misconception. They all often place it along with countries as Turkey, China, Brazil, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Timor-Leste even, and many other providers of South-South cooperation. And by emerging or new donors, experts and policymakers meant that they are not established, they are not traditional players in the arena, as the members of the Western community, of the Western Club of Donors, Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, such as US, Canada, European countries, etc. So 10 years ago, this dichotomy, established versus emerging donor, or old versus new donors, was even more interesting. Then the group of new donors included countries of the former Eastern Bloc, Hungary, Poland, Romania. Almost all these countries have already become members of the OECD DAC, and suddenly they cease to be emerging anew. But the main idea is still there. On this slide that you are seeing, I would like to show two recent examples of how Russia as a donor is represented in academic and public discourse. On the left, you can see a figure taken from an article of Jeffrey Jackson from University of Mississippi. Here, Russia as a donor, here it is. It's not that clear, but you can see it. It seems like Russia as a donor emerges out of blue in 2005 and joins the ranks of the non-OECD donors, later than Iceland or Latvia, and about a decade after Turkey. On the right, you can see another diagram taken from an extremely popular resource, DevEx portal, reproduced in Deutsche Welle, which is quite an influential resource, right? And aimed at an international audience. Here, Russia is put on the same footing as Turkey. But the idea that Russia is a new donor, is an emerging donor, is to me absolutely nonsensical, because Russia is a legal successor to the Soviet Union. And the USSR provided assistance to countries in the near abroad even before the World War II, where there was no institutionalized development cooperation in the Western countries whatsoever. During the time of the Cold War, Soviet Union was present in as many corners of the globe as the Western donors. And if we try to account for the differences in wages that were paid to the Western and Soviet specialists engaged in assistance projects, the Soviets' contribution to global development was comparable to that of the United States or other major donors. So some of the Western resources duly acknowledge that and prefer to talk about re-emergence of Russia as a donor. They emphasize the continuity with the Soviet period. And I illustrated with an example of a publication on the site, the 8Data research laboratory in the United States presented. Re-emergence is not probably the right term, but it's definitely better than new or emerging. Russia is not a newcomer in this business, full stop. As a successor of the Soviet Union, Russia can legitimately be called a traditional non-Western provider of development cooperation, and it keeps its non-Westernness. Russia is not a part, and probably will never be, a part of the OECD DAC. It doesn't need to probably, and will keep its autonomy. So my second point, Russia is a more significant provider of official development cooperation than often portrayed. Russia's international standing as a donor is quite peculiar. On the one hand, it's not a member of the OECD. On the other, it's the only country from the BRICS grouping that reports its official development assistance to the OECD DAC. You all know that statistical data is not void of politics, and its representation is political. And this is exactly what can be seen in the case of the statistics on providers of ODA on the OECD official website. If we go there and look at the list of official providers, we would not even see Russia or its partners, look at the left side, in the BRICS in this list. But we will see there some other donors, quite new ones, like Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan. Some of these donors are not OECD members, some are participants to the DAC, some provide statistics, some not, but Russia does not provide these statistics in a detailed fashion, only on aggregate level. And this creates a specific impression. Russia can be found only if we make an extra effort and click on other official providers reporting at the aggregate level to the OECD. If we do that, we will know that Russia's contribution to international development is actually around $1.3 billion, which is tens and sometimes 100 times more than the contribution of some other countries that are mentioned in the main list. And Russia is found in a very strange company with Bulgaria, Liechtenstein, Malta, Thailand, and Chinese Taipei, as the OECD mentions it. Actual contribution of Russia to international development is much larger, and it has to be taken into account. If we use only the official figures from the OECD, basically Russia would be placed around 21st place along with Austria or Finland. But definitely it is not the real amount of money that Russia gives to other countries. Russia's actual contribution to sustainable development is much larger than that. And there are several reasons for that. One reason is that there are some large recipients of the Russian ODA, as Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, that are not included in the DAC statistics. This assistance is not counted. Russia's contribution to multilateral development banks, such as New Development Bank or Eurasian Development Bank, is also not counted. Why? Because these institutions were not certified by the DAC as multilateral channels of assistance. So basically hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars that Russia provides to these organizations are simply excluded. This also extrapolates to the relative level of ODA versus GNI, basically the generosity of a donor. Again, the generosity, the level of effort that a country makes. If so much money is basically being excluded, definitely Russia is not as generous in the statistics as it actually is. Why? Also, because Russia underreports the aid that it provides. This is a problem because the information that we see here in the OECD statistics is almost the single resource of information that is available from the outside. And here come my third point. Russia actually is much more versatile donor than often portrayed. What I mean by that? If we use only publicly available information, Russian international development bilateral assistance would be quite unimpressive. It would consist mainly of debt relief, project assistance, and some small contributions to NGOs, to actually local NGOs. It would seem as if Russia does not provide any technical assistance, does not send volunteers to foreign countries, does not even educate foreign students on its soil. And this picture drastically differs from the structure of assistance being provided by Western countries, by DAC members. Does this in any way represent the reality? No, no. And in the right column, I just mentioned several examples of the assistance in every single category, which is marked in red here in the official statistics, but is marked in green here in the right column, because Russia has something to demonstrate, and already it is something that it has been doing, or it wants to do in the nearest future. Just look at these figures, for example, of government scholarships. Already 18,000 scholarships provided in 2021. More to follow, 30,000 in 2023. There are larger programs. I would not give details on them. Probably we will discuss it later on, but they have been launched and they will be quite big one in the nearest future. Like, for example, mobility program, Mission Goodwill, or Dobro in Russian, or New Generation, Новое поколение program, etc. So Russia has something to offer in every single category, and uses quite a broad spectrum of development cooperation instruments, modalities, as broad as these established Western donors. If you go online, you will see that Russia also provide assistance not only through state institutions, but through a large network, through an ecosystem of different networks of players, which include not only state institutions, but regional, municipal authorities, private businesses, NGOs. And to make you understand that, I will just give you an example of several COVID-19 initiatives which were provided through the networks of private businesses plus NGOs, regional authorities plus private businesses, etc. So my fourth point, Russia is a much more ambitious player than often portrayed. We all remember the Obama's administration famous quote, an intent to downgrade Russia to a status of a regional power, right? Not that important on the global scale. And this tendency of downgrading Russia's status was also present in several recent quotes that I put on the slide. One is from US Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, David Schenker, in October 2019. And the other one is from a recent publication from Carnegie Foundation. In the example number one, it said that Russia's aid to the MENA region, to the Middle East and North Africa, did not exceed $100 million in a decade, while US aid was about 58 billion. Just imagine the difference, right? But if the difference was so big, would Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, would he have any intent even to mention that? Probably not, because Russia is important and provides much more than these official figures. The example number two, you can see this quote. I would not comment on that. You understand that it's also kind of downgrading the Russia's effort, downgrading. What I want to say is that in terms of regional scope and sectoral scope, Russia's reach is also much broader. In the operational concept of international development cooperation, there are some certain priority country groupings, as you could see. In the current concept, there is no hierarchy of particular regions apart from the CIS. All other three categories are actually global in their scope. They can be states from any corner of the globe. And if you look at the statistics again, and at the list of top 10 Russian recipients of Russian aid, you can see here not only the CIS countries. Yes, Kyrgyzstan and Armenia and Tajikistan definitely here, and Belarus with a figure that I would comment probably later are here, but we can see also Syria, Serbia, Nicaragua, Guinea, etc. So too many for a regional power, don't you think? The same is true for sectoral distribution. Just look at the number of sectors mentioned in the concept of Russia's international development cooperation on the left. There are many very important for the future development sectors here, like, for example, ensuring technological sovereignty, ICT, or post-conflict peace building, or even fight against organized crime and international terrorism. Imagine the situation after the collapse of the regime in Afghanistan and the accession of power of Taliban. In all these sectors, Russia has something to provide as technical assistance and can be a very important partner in so-called triangular cooperation. And the final point that Russia is a more dynamic donor than it seems, than it's portrayed. On the first sight, it might look that there is not so much happening in terms of organizational changes in national system. The latest concept is of 2014. There have not been any major new agency established or new legislation adopted, but actually it's not true. It would be an illusion because the system is in a transformation, is in flux. And the origins of this transformation has started around 2014 and much accelerated after new leadership of Россотрудничества came 1.5 years ago. I can mention only four important institutional developments: adoption on new rules on providing state loans to foreign countries, establishing the Interagency Commission, launching a new state program, international development assistance, under the primary responsibility of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and actually the new national security strategy, which was adopted this July, reaffirms that the intensification of international development cooperation, primarily in the post-Soviet space, is one of the tasks relevant for achieving Russia's Federation foreign policy goals. And I will conclude with the list that I compiled for this particular event of possible competitive advantages of Russia as a donor. It is not definitely exhaustive. It can be added something, but I would add that philanthropy is ingrained in national character. And this is an important trait. There is an impressive historic track record as Soviet legacy. We have recent experience in providing humanitarian and development cooperation in the most complex environments on earth, and the best case would be Syria. I would invite you to look at this list. Probably you would argue against something, or you would add something more. But I think that we have definitely to think about these development cooperation competitive advantages of Russia and see how we as a community can contribute to fulfilling the potential of these competitive advantages. And I'm ready for Q&A and discussion on this.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. So just as you said, I think one of the major problems is what we count as development assistance and what we don't count. And it's, well, we do have a problem here, and this is why, for instance, within the process of preparation of the state program on assistance to international development, we actually included there the points related to awareness campaigns. And actually, we should talk more about what Russia is doing, and actually not only on multilateral level, but also on bilateral level. And of course, it will be important just in order to comply with Fedor's thesis about selfishness, to assess the real demands on the spot of the countries that we are going to help to, and to check, let's say, the amount of the projects, their efficiency, their effect that they will have to social development in these countries, and so on. So we will definitely need this kind of feedback as soon as we start the implementation of this state program. Also, just for those of you who are interested, I would like to make a short announcement about November 2nd. So next week on Tuesday, on November 2nd, we will have a press conference in the Russian news agency, RIA Novosti, right? So about our recent survey in the countries of the former Soviet Union about their attitude towards Russia's assistance, their attitude towards Russian language, Russian education, and so on. So this is quite a recent survey that was conducted in summer, and we will present the results to show what kind of attitude of the population is there in the countries of the former Soviet Union to what Russia is doing. So please, join us. I'm sure that there will be translation on their website and in our Facebook. So follow the news. Now, just one question to Vladimir, because I mean there was this table about Russia's assistance, and it was like $693 million, and then in the next graph $100 billion. So what's the figure? Just was quite confused here.
1 second, I would try to, if you could.
Yeah, there was this table. Yeah. So this 693 million, and then this 103.
Yeah, it's compared with the contribution of the whole DAC members community. So I compare here Russia's contribution with the established donors community, and I show that the structure of assistance of the Western DAC members is completely different. We can see here that all categories, all columns and rows are actually filled when Russia has zeros in many categories. It can't be possible. It's not correct. It's not right.
Okay, so it means that actually it's more than just 1% of of the total figure, right?
Yeah, it's just bilateral aid. It's slightly less than 1%. It's 0.5% of the DAC effort here.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. Now, there's a few questions in our chat, which I can read out, right? So one of them is related to Fёdor and his recent participation in the Wildlife Forum, and definitely his session with Vladimir Putin. So the question is, the president of Russia addressed contemporary issues in the world, including issues of tolerance, new trends, and the world structure. He also presented a new ideology for the country, stressing that healthy conservatism is the best way to deal with challenges and threats that keep multiplying. So the question is, what does the adjective healthy mean for the orientations of Russian ideology? What is healthy, Fёdor? What is the degree of healthness?
I'm not a doctor, unfortunately, so I'm seriously, it's very difficult to identify which conservatism is healthy, which is less healthy. And by the way, I asked President Putin for clarification. I wouldn't say he said something very indicative in this. I'm basically a little bit skeptical at our contemporary quest for national ID and ideology, which is one of Russian intellectual leitmotifs nowadays. I understand why it happens, because of course any country should aspire some kind of sense of existence, and the attempt to base our national policy on just mercantilist approaches, which was the case after collapse of the Soviet Union. So the liberal approach sometimes simplified to economic predetermination of everything, that was not very successful. So now it's an attempt to formulate some kind of framework. But first of all, it's not that easy to do it by purpose, so to say, to decide to collect a group of intellectuals and then to present a national idea. It does happen in this way. Secondly, I think, and that's actually what Putin, from my point of view, did mean in his speech, today's world is extremely dangerous, complicated, and unpredictable. And the main virtue for anybody is to be as cautious and balanced and calculated as possible. Because if you read the whole speech, conservatism in his interpretation is not so much about a particular setup of principles, but it's about being based on common sense and understanding of realism. And this understanding brings any responsible leader to the conclusion that you should not go to extremes. And that's what that was, by the way, one of the most important messages from Putin in this speech, that revolutions and radical changes never bring anything but suffering, based also on Russian and Soviet experience. And I understand it as Putin's reaction to this totally confusing international situation. Let's try to be reasonable and conservative, because conservatives at least are not inclined to get engaged in some socio or economic or political experiments and testing on untested waters. So that's how I understand it. I'm not sure that President Putin has a clear ideology in his mind. He's on the way to that, but not yet.
Okay, thanks. Well, to my mind, just to continue this this discussion, well, I believe that actually when President Putin was speaking about conservatism, he meant, of course, first of all, Russia's commitment to traditional values, contrary to the kind of radical approaches that we see in some parts of the world towards the new family models and things like that. And of course, I agree that the kind of, the leitmotif of his speech was conservatism versus revolutions and all sorts of, violent changes of the current world order. So it was more about that, and that is why it's healthy. And so it's healthy because it's actually therapy approach, not surgery approach towards international relations. The second question is, I don't know who of you will pick it up. So the question is about WHO. So the COVID pandemic is underway. There is a huge impact on world economy, human health and safety, a lot of money spent. At the same time, the WHO is dealing poorly with the pandemic. So bad recommendations follow other bad recommendations. And the question is, what is Russia's position on the WHO dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? Whether we should reform the WHO or create a brand new organization. So what do you think as experts on international relations? So what's Russia's assessment of this terrible situation with COVID and WHO efforts?
Fёdor, if you don't mind, I would comment on that. I think that we have to keep in mind that Russia was actually quite vocal during the pandemic about this issue, saying that, yes, probably WHO should be reformed, but after all this mess will pass. And this is quite an interesting position, because we cannot allow ourselves to deal with such a challenge without an international organization specializing in these issues. We can argue about confirming certificates for certain vaccines, but it will be dealt with. Finally, Sputnik V will get the certificate, I'm completely sure. But the approach of the United States, for example, to withdraw from the organization, to stop funding the organization in the middle of the pandemic was not very responsible step. If we think about reforming institutions, and Russia was in general very cautious about serious, quick, accelerated reforms of any United Nations institutions, including the Security Council, including many other specialized institutions within the UN system. Even if we talk only about WHO, I think we have to keep in mind two things. One is that creating a new organization would not eliminate the problems that we right now have within the WHO and with the pandemic, this one and future ones. Why? Because as the negotiations in the WTO, the World Trade Organizations, not WHO, but WTO organizations, on eliminating, the limitations on the waivers for patents for vaccinations, right? All these huge negotiations that are now taking place showed that there is an opposition from the business community not to share vaccines as they are supposed to, not from the countries, but also from business community. And this problem will not be solved through reforming WHO. And point number two is that during the last decade, we have seen a trend in international development cooperation that was called bilateralization of multilateral assistance, which means that basically we have, the core budgets and the non-core budgets of organizations, right? The core budget is what countries, the money that country gives to a multilateral organization, and it becomes a part of its budget and it decides what to do with that, right? So it's kind of trust that one country has in the multilateral organization. But there is multi-bilateral aid, non-core contributions, basically creating, sort of specific funds for specific problems with much more control over the money that these organizations have. And within the WHO, there are also many these kind of more flexible mechanisms that can be implemented in this kind of situation. Apart from reforming, you can also engage these kind of trust funds, different modalities, financial, etc.
Okay, thanks. Fedor, what do you think, from the point of your thesis about selfishness? So how far the countries should be involved in the work of the WHO?
It has not so much to do with my idea about selfishness. That's another problem, which I think it's much broader than the future and the fate of the WHO. It's about the future of international institutions at large. Because what we see now is, of course, unfortunately, the obvious decline of most of institutions, including even those who believed to be the most successful after the end of the Cold War. So if we look at the European Union or NATO, however they promote themselves, but it's certainly not the best period in their history, and the next steps certainly will be even more complicated. Not to talk about organizations which were created for purposes of the previous era, and actually most of international institutions were products of post-Second World War international arrangement, which was absolutely unique and great. The UN's, United Nations, and all connected to that, including WHO. But now we see that the period of regulated and institutionalized international politics is about to end. And on the one hand, of course, it's not the reason to destroy the remaining institutions. And in this regard, I think, as Vladimir rightly said, we might have a lot of claims about particular organizations, including World Health Organization, but it's better to have this as a coordination mechanism or as an expert panel and so on, than to destroy it. The Americans tried to do it, and actually they came back because they also realized how wrong it was. But I don't believe we can expect that those organizations, again, created at a different time for different international environment, they will be as efficient in the future as they used to be in the past. And in this regard, I think all of us should support those agencies, WHO, but many others, the refugee body, and all those inside the United Nations. But again, we should be realists and understand that we cannot rely on those institutions in the future as means to maintain international stability only. So we need to rely much more on bilateral or multilateral arrangements between countries, which brings me back to selfishness, because again, I believe that in this kind of relationship, selfishness is absolutely indispensable.
Okay, perfect. So next question to Vladimir. So is it possible that Russia's contribution as a donor is underestimated by the West for the reason that statistics is not transparent and hard for to achieve through open access? I think it's partly what you have been talking about, right?
Yeah, but actually not at all. It's quite the opposite. The statistics itself is quite transparent. The problem is that all these people who I provided quotes of, like U.S. Assistant Secretary for Secretary of State, or the people from Carnegie Foundation, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, they use the official statistics, which is completely transparent. It was uploaded on the OECD website. It's accessible to all. You can all do the same procedure. The problem is that these figures are fragmented and incomplete, and there is a technical issue and political issue. Technical issue is the problem of again, underreporting of aid that I covered. This is a problem on our side, for example, on Russian side. It can be solved, and I have been quite a vocal proponent for being as transparent about anything that we spend as we can, because it's very important to provide trust against international development cooperation partners. But there is a political problem that should be also taken into account. The fact that some unrecognized states are not included in the ODA recipient list is a problem. Because, for example, Kosovo is there. Kosovo is there, while some unrecognized states on the post-Soviet space are not. This is political, as well as inclusion of Eurasian integration multilateral institutions. This where we want and need the support from other donors to push for inclusion of these multilateral institutions. Again, coming back to multilateralism, right? It would be beneficial not only for Russia, but for all. New BRICS Development Bank, it's a big organization, huge one, with billions of dollars. Why, in what aspect is it worse than, for example, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank? Why AIIB is included and New Development Bank or Eurasian Bank are excluded? I do not understand that. And I was trying to justify this point before Россотрудничество and other organizations.
Okay, then a question from Romania to Fёdor again, partly related to foreign policy more than international development. So do you consider that Black Sea is the biggest problem between Romania and Russia right now, and is it unsolvable? I think the Black Sea is the biggest problem not only between Romania and Russia, but among other countries.
Yeah, exactly. That's you already answered. With all due respect, I don't see any problem between Romania and Russia in the Black Sea. What is the problem? The problem is that Black Sea is, of course, an area for serious strategic and geopolitical tensions now, but it's not because of Russian-Romanian relationship. It's because of reasons which all of us know. So no, I don't think it has to do with Romania at all.
Okay, thanks. Any more questions? Because the chat right now is empty, so perhaps anyone would like to ask the question. We still have some time for that. Okay. Yeah, Anastasia. Yes, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. It was a very informative session. I will have a short question, but probably the answer should be a bit broader. Just more negotiations are going about the possible restructurization of the United Nations. The issue was raised by Turkey. Vladimir Putin also replied on this issue, and while today speaking about the new format of cooperation, and still those institutions who are obliged to deal with the global issues. Mr. Lukyanov, if it's possible to get your answer on this issue, your approach to the proposals about the new ways the UN should work, about restructurization, about the expansion of the UN Security Council. How do you see this process, and do you still think that the UN will be kept in the format as it is today?
I'm very sorry, I did not hear well. Could you please repeat the question, maybe shorter?
Yes, please. Your attitude to those conversations around the restructurization of the United Nations, whether the Security Council should be enlarged, whether there should be some new players in the system, or probably just not about the expansion of the Security Council, but any other attitude to the work of the United Nations in the current time.
You know, it's quite obvious that the current composition of the Security Council and larger in the main institutions on the UN is not reflecting the reality of 2021. And actually, President Putin at Valde said it very clearly. But to change it is impossible, because to change it, you need unanimity, you need a consensus among all. First of all, permanent members of Security Council, but broader actually, who, how should join, can join. And this consensus is unreachable, is beyond any possibility to reach. That's fact of life. You cannot agree on how the Security Council will change for two reasons. One reason, I don't know any example in history when countries which had special privileges would voluntarily give up them. And so those 5 permanent members of Security Council, none of them will be interested to be deprived from those privileges or even to extend them to others. And second reason, you cannot find any criteria on which you will enlarge Security Council. Okay, let's imagine the impossible, that P5 agreed, okay, let's open up. For whom? What is the criteria? Regional, economy, nuclear arms, even if regional, who should represent Africa? Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, who should represent Latin America, and so on? No way. The only criteria after the Second World War was who won the war. That's it. Fortunately, we don't have any war yet, World War. So as long as we don't have the war, I don't believe we can change the Security Council composition.
Yeah, I just was thinking while we were answering. So, what kind of event can actually force the countries of the world to get back to the negotiation table and to somehow reform the world order? And it seems that, yeah, so after World War II, it was clear that everyone was affected, and they found the courage and flexibility to achieve this kind of things. In 1968, because of the quick spread of the nuclear weapons, they also agreed on the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which is still alive, and more or less working, and one of the pillars of the international security. But now, well, COVID and things like that, they're not that effective, in pushing the countries towards dialogue, and it's a pity. So, I mean, just we need probably a kind of stronger shock, to make the international community to start working on global solutions to the global problems, unfortunately. Okay, any more questions to our speakers?
May I add just one very quick point to what Fёdor said about reforming the UN Security Council? Just and about the pretext that might actually be used to establish a new world order. We have to get back not only to 1945 as the end of the World War II, but we can also think of what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. Even such a strategic shock was not strong enough to establish a new system, which still has the same underpinning fundamentals that were established back then. And all the efforts to do something beyond this system that were undertaken by mostly the United States and the coalitions of willing, etc., did not work exactly for the reason because trying to present the victory in the collapse of the Soviet Union as the victory in the Cold War, it was artificial. Not many believed in that, right? To establish the world order that would be a new one. I see it as this.
Okay. So if we don't have any more questions or comments, yes, Tatiana, please. Yeah, but just switch on the mic.
I will have a very short and anthropological questions. And could we see the problem, the current problem, as a confrontation between countries which are projected in the short term and other countries, a group of other countries which are more keen on the long term? And Russia and the BRICS would be more keen on the long term, and some old European countries would be more, and maybe it's also related to their political systems. So that's could we see that like that?
Anybody answer?
Probably you hint to the problem which several Western countries have now with the necessity to adapt policy making to the next election. That the period is very short, and you need to think first of all about the election result, and maybe afterwards about the future. I would love to say that yes, this is the case, and countries with less frequent elections or less frequent changes after elections have privilege and have preferences. But unfortunately, I'm not sure that this is the case, because we have this idea in particular about China, that China has such a long-term strategy, which is decades, if not centuries. But I think it should be studied more carefully, because as we see, even in case they have it, but circumstances are such that even those long-term thinkers, they need to be very busy with adapting their long-term goals on the very short time basis, and change many priorities. Not to talk about other BRICS countries, I don't believe, unfortunately, that Brazil has such a long strategy which allows it to look beyond the term of current president. Same with India, same with Russia. So all countries are mostly preoccupied with needs which are very urgent, and unfortunately they are very multiple. So yeah, it would be fine to see less democracy as a bigger privilege, but I doubt.
Okay. Yeah, Vladimir.
Yeah, we tend to see, you know, again, this through the lens of dichotomy of conservatism versus liberalism in a way, right? Probably the type of regime. But actually, the interesting point is that liberalism at the very beginning was promoting, you know, universal natural human rights, perennial subjects that are very also long-term freedom, etc. But the point is that these perennial subjects and values are being reinterpreted every single election cycle, and it is very hard to see countries that were trying to present themselves as the city on the hill reinterpreting completely the domestic strategy in 4 years' time. This is the point. And this is what makes probably some countries in the developing world seek for another development model, more oriented towards those being provided by providers of South-South cooperation, and probably even Russia as well.
Okay, thanks. The development should be focused on happiness, I guess. I mean, so the more I study the international relations and the current approaches to the economic development, etc., you see that many countries today focus on kind of more holistic approach towards human development, and actually they don't speak any longer about GDP growth and things like that, but focus more on some other issues like some complex approach towards human development and human happiness. Okay, so let's then sum it up. It was, I think, a very good and very interesting discussion, and I thank both of our speakers for their very interesting thoughts and suggestions about Russian foreign policy, about our participation in the international development assistance and things like that. I think it became much clearer for us today how it all works and what we actually mean by this kind of assistance to international development. And definitely, as I said, I would like to invite you once again to our press conference on November 2nd, on next Tuesday, concerning the survey that we made in the countries of the former Soviet Union and their attitude towards Russian aid and towards Russian language and so on. So thanks a lot for your participation today, and have a nice evening or day for those of you who live in South America. So it was a pleasure to see you all, and we'll have our next meeting of the Public Council of the Россотрудничества in late November, and it will be devoted to cultural cooperation. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.